If you ever get a chance to explore an abandoned school, whatever you do, don't feed the students. There are some cons to being the only person who lives in walking distance of the school I teach. Every single time the alarm goes off or someone forgets to lock, I'm called in. And at times, I feel like this has become more of a custodial job than anything. It's gotten so bad that the school had a silent alarm installed years ago, and just to add insult to injury, they routed it to my phone. Of course, the head tends to call me up to make sure I'm on my way, just in case. "Just have a quick little walk around," Mrs. Wes says to me over the phone. "Just make sure some of the kids haven't tried breaking into the pool again. It'd be awful if something happened." Right, yeah, except it never is just a quick little walk around. There's always something to keep you lingering, some noise that needs investigating, some mess that can't be left for kids to find. In the day, that school is nothing but a shrine to the banal and mediocre. The walls are plastered with kitschy GCSE art of local beaches, bronze awards in athletics, and cardboard thermometers used to count the hundreds of dollars we've raised to stave off cancer or the apocalypse. With light streaming in and the halls buzzing with running children, it's nothing but another part of the world whistling through space with fuck all to do except keep busy. But it's different in the dark, or perhaps just when it's empty. Maybe it's because I see it so alive and full of activity in the day. There's something innately unsettling about a place only recently emptied of life. Perhaps there's a lingering body heat in the air, or a scent too subtle for the conscious mind to register. Something that tells you 1,000 eyes have looked away from this place, and now it exists outside of anyone's notice but yours. You feel alone, walking these empty corridors whose walls look unusually tall, and where the distance stretches away into dizzying perspective. And it always looks so much worse at night. Maybe it's the effect bright fluorescents have, but I swear it looks cleaner in the day, and come night, the floors look filthy and cracked in a way that makes me wonder if this is really the elitist private school it pretends to be. But I hate it. I hate how I only notice the rot at night. Moldy tiles, cheap laminate flooring that's buckled from moisture, and equipment that was dated in the 90s. It's such a silly thing to let the dark get to me like that. But then again, it's not at all uncommon to hear giggling or see shadows moving in the corner of your eye. It is impossible to escape the feeling you are following something, tracing the path of a laughing child as they run from classroom to classroom. Doors will swing gently ajar as you turn a corner. Chairs will squeak seconds before entering a room. And TVs will blare with documentaries only to switch off just before your finger touches the button. And for some reason, I just keep looking. I keep going from room to room, sometimes twice around, sometimes for hours. Once I sat alone in my classroom, lights switched off, and listened quietly as someone took a seat and the sound of a scribbling pencil filled the silence. By the time it finally stopped, the sun was rising, and the only thing left behind was a badly chewed pencil, the wood bloodied and rancid, like it had been dragged out of a septic tank. It was so late I didn't even bother going home. I just stayed until 7C filed in as normal a few short hours later. I've thought about leaving, but I didn't exactly exit my last school in good standing. This place doesn't seem to mind so much if I skip a lesson or two or turn up hungover. And despite my regular difficulties, there is still a monthly bonus attached to my check that I was told the other staff would not hear about. I have to figure it's for the extra work, and I wonder if I'd be mad to turn this place down. I know with some certainty that if I ever told Mrs. Wares I couldn't check in on the school, I wouldn't keep my job for much longer, and I can't help but wonder if I'm the butt of some big joke. Sometimes, I find myself going in there without being called. From my house, I can see the chemistry lab, which is a large glass building that's freezing in winter and scalding in the summer. It's all windows, and on a bright night, I can see people moving around in it. Sometimes there's a light, sometimes just the vague sense of a commotion. But I can't stop myself checking it out in person, walking around the very space I once spied from a quarter of a mile away where my house backs onto the football field. It's weird. I might find a broken phone, something way too old for today's kids, or a bag of pennies, or even a few teeth scattered around the floor. What are they doing, I wonder? I found out from the IT teacher that every day he has to come in and restart all the computers because their screens will be frozen on shocking websites. He didn't make a big thing of it, he just said it wasn't nice and if he was ever ill, I'd have to do it. So, I went one night, went and sat in the IT room with 15 old computers in 3 rows of 5. It's small, we're not a big school, just 500 kids, and the room doesn't actually catch much light where it is, so it felt more like a dungeon than my own room that's usually a clean greyish blue at night. It was pitch black in there, and once again I turned off my light and waited for something I didn't know, until one by one the monitors thunked on and internal fans started up, going from a silent burr to a frenetic and unnatural whine. I felt a kind of panic, something I attributed to the rising volume of the computers and the epileptic sight of the monitor's glitchy flashing. I steadied myself though, and waited it out, until the monitors clicked from buggy displays to images of mutilated and brutalized bodies, smashed mouths with exposed teeth and cracked bone, rib cages held open by groping fingers, soft thighs shredded by broken bottles. Each image was different and riddled with pixelated artifacts. After a moment, the fans died down and the monitors settled, and the room was lit up from within like a Christmas tree, and I suddenly became aware that I couldn't see anything else. The bright light unsettled my eyes so much that all I could make out were the screens that floated in the abyssal darkness. Something deep within me started screaming that I wasn't alone, and my eyes darted to the spaces beside and behind the computers, even under the shadowy desks, but it was all impenetrable shadow. Suddenly, the images animated, and I suppressed a gasp and a shudder. Each one looped at different rates, some juddering with half a second of motion, others playing out elaborate acts of violence across the silent seconds. I turned my torch on and tried to force myself to move, but didn't even manage to take a step. The door I'd entered from, the one I'd firmly closed before settling down, was open, and tar-black footprints led into the computer room and stopped by one of the computers. I shone a light down a fraction to see beneath the desk, and I found myself wondering if there had been a glimmer of motion as I moved the light, as if something had retreated from the beam. A few pale fingers, a scrap of fabric, or the tip of someone's foot. My mind was racing, and I was paralyzed with fear, and in the end, I simply waited it out until the sun rose and the room lit up naturally. It took hours, and those hours were not silent. Whoever was in there with me was sobbing quietly, their muffled cries ebbing with the change of the gore-streaked monitors. God, it's strange to say, but over time, those images didn't look so pixelated, and for the very last hour, I swore I wasn't looking through a screen at all. It really was like standing around 15 windows looking into torture cells. It wasn't about clarity. There was a sense of depth you just don't get from a computer. There were hours of unbridled suffering, assaults, torture, sadism, groups of people laughing at a shivering victim who was left to pick glass out of their body, the gleeful joy in humiliation, in the power of what a gun can do to the human body and its owner. It all blurred together into a moving montage, and at times I wonder how much of what I remember I actually saw. By the time I was ready to turn the monitors off, I was pale and shaking, and my face was streaked with tears. The footprints had disappeared in the light, but I couldn't bring myself to check the desk where they'd led. I merely thumbed the off switch on each computer before hurrying out like a child afraid of the dark. It'd be a lie to say the things here make me drink. I've always had a problem, but it was different before. I was prone to bad bouts of drunkenness for most of my life, but I might spend months, even years, reasonably sober. I either didn't drink or I drank a lot. It's just that when I went off the deep end, I went in head first, and wouldn't resurface until I was dragged, kicking and screaming out of the pool. But now, I drink every day. I keep a flask on me just to take the edge off. It makes things a little fuzzy, makes the kids funnier, makes the staff friendlier, makes me a better liar. I wake up in the school some nights, unsure of how I got there, or if I ever even left. Sometimes I open my eyes and don't even know if I'm awake or asleep, or alive or dead, because there's just blackness. Only the cold feel of the tiles beneath my shirt and my hands lets me know where I am. In the distance, a door will groan as it swings open. I might hear the shuffle of a few chairs, or the barely suppressed whispers of a fleeting presence. And I lie there, ears pricked to these sounds, and I wonder if I even really hear them at all, or if I'm just going mad. But I wait. I wait for the sun and for my eyes to see again, and I find myself lying on the floor of my classroom with the desks piled high around me, and I find it hard to answer anything except yes to that question. Once, I awoke with an old pencil case in my hand, a faded Space Jam logo on the gel plastic front. It was coated with dust and stuffed full of long dead felt-tip pens. The weight of it in my hands stole some of the dreamlike haze away from my mind, and I grabbed my phone for light to check where I was. I sat up in the middle of my classroom and steadied myself while I studied the strange object in my hand. It was 3 a.m. The school's distant halls buzzed with an uneasy silence, and I pulled myself up to go looking around. For what? I didn't know, but the strange case in my hand gave me an unusual sense of purpose, and I searched until I found a loose ceiling tile in the assembly hall, the height of which is easily 30 feet. I might have been inclined to leave it, especially after I turned on the lights and found myself staring at the distant corners, as if firm in the knowledge that I wasn't alone. But there was no giggling in the air tonight, nor squeaking chairs or anything else. It felt as if the school itself was holding its breath as I dragged out the enormous stepladder used by maintenance and began my shaky ascent. God, even now I wonder how I found the courage. I'm terrified of heights, but I climbed up anyway until my fingertips could reach out and gently push the tile further away. A flurry of empty crisp wrappers and crumpled paper fell out, and I clutched the stepladder with white knuckles and wide eyes as my startled reaction sent it wobbling side to side. When it finally settled back on all four legs, I breathed a sigh of relief and rapidly began descending, feeling only some mild sense of safety when my feet were back on the ground. I knew the ceiling was too lightweight for anyone to be up there, and yet I stared at the small pile of rubbish with a worrying sense of unease. The food was ancient, the paper covered with felt-tip drawings, and I found a dried-up pen that matched the others in the pencil case. More than that, though, there was a stench that emanated from the pile and made me think of desperation and neglect. And amongst the rubbish was a plastic bag with bottles of unhealthy-looking piss and a wet rag that looked like it had been pulling toilet duty for quite a while. When I finally turned my attention back to my surroundings, I saw I was not alone. From the size of him, I'd say he was around 13, and he had somehow approached me without me hearing him or seeing him, stopping only when he was a few meters away, where he crouched low to the floor and swayed from side to side. He looked like an animal, certainly feral in the way he moved, but it wasn't his demeanor that made me cry out. It was the gaping hole where his face should have been. The skull caved in like a hollowed-out egg. His remaining skin was pockmarked and lesioned, and it took me a moment to register that he was naked. He was waiting for something, though I didn't know what. I tried to take a step towards the nearest door, but he took one too. He knew where I was, that much was clear, even if I couldn't quite figure out how. I considered shining my torch straight at him, given that the faraway ceiling lights made the hole in his head pure shadow, but there was a faint impression of wriggling amongst the darkness that made my stomach churn, and I had no idea how this thing would even react to the situation. I'm still not sure what put the connection in my head, but I eventually reached out to my back pocket and took the pencil case out. The boy started gibbering at the sight of it, and I cringed at the realization the wet, excited sound was coming from his cave-like skull. But I slid the case across the floor anyway. He snatched it up eagerly and immediately ran to the nearest wall, where he scaled it with the wet sound of a gecko running up glass. With one final flourish, he stuck to the ceiling and slithered behind the loose ceiling tile like a spider. After a few seconds, the tile shunted back into place, and it looked like nothing had ever happened. Some of the kids, I think, know more than they're letting on. They're not difficult kids. Most of them are quite smart. This place pumps out Oxbridge candidates like crazy, and the parents pay big fees to help smooth things over when stuff goes wrong. Suicides and runaways aren't uncommon, but we're always told it's a consequence of pressure, ambition, social difficulties, and so on. So now we hand out questionnaires twice a year to ask our students about stress. The RE teacher doubles as a counselor, and we have a mental health awareness day every October, but it has never sat right with me to act like the two things are related. James Kinsberg, for example, went missing a few years back. He was a rugby player who wanted to study medicine, and rumours were he could even be looking at a contract to play under 21s for a local team. He was a big, strong boy, and yet one day I found myself trying to drag him out of the pool, half conscious. In the moment, you just think, oh geez, a student is drowning, and in my head, my students are all kids, you see. But it was only after I dragged him out that I found myself wondering how the hell he'd found himself in trouble. He looked like he could wrestle an orca and win, but he was there on the floor, shivering and sputtering water out of his mouth. When I looked back at the pool, there was a kind of moment of recognition. I'm not sure what exactly, just a dimming of the overhead lights, a muted silence, a tinny laugh I could not place amidst the gaggle of kids he crowded around us. But I looked back at James and wondered if he'd run into any real trouble at all, because the look in his eye wasn't one of someone who'd nearly drowned, but instead of someone who didn't care. He made me think of myself, lying there on my classroom floor in total darkness, and that was how we'd found him. It had all started with screaming and shouting, and I had ran over from the bleachers where I was acting as substitute for the lesson, only to see him pale and blue, lying down at the bottom of the pool. He didn't resist when I dove in and hauled him up, but it was like he wasn't really there, like the lights were on but nobody was home. When he went missing, I extended my rounds to include the pool. It's a huge warehouse of a room, and the water paints pretty lights on the walls, even in the dark since the roof is mostly glass panes. But I don't like it. The bleachers are all in a neat row with scaffolding behind to make strange shadows, and the damn filters bang every few seconds from water that churns and makes odd shapes of the tiles beneath the waves. When I first dove in to save him, I opened my eyes underwater for just a few seconds and got the strangest sense something hideous was nearby. But the pool wasn't empty and it could have been anything. But a few times in the night, I have seen something slithering out of sight as I walk around the water's edge. It isn't human, I think. Although I have, on occasion, seen the faceless boy standing at the bottom of the water with eerie stillness. But I don't think it was him that James saw. I think it was something else. Something that looks like a mass of hair drifting in a current. Something that effortlessly pushes itself from shadow to shadow. Something that, occasionally, slaps its way onto dry land and watches me from behind the bleachers as I check the perimeter. I don't know where it lives. God knows it can't be in the water all the time. But when I confronted James and asked him what he saw, he told me only that it wasn't going to leave him alone. Not now, not ever. And a few weeks later, he went missing while out for a jog along the beach. When they found him, he'd been hollowed out and stuffed into a storm drain like an inside-out gym sock. "It'll eat you," he said, but that was all he ever offered me. We all acted like he'd committed suicide from the pressure, even as the rumors filled the school. How could the two things possibly be linked? I saw the photos of what happened to him. Even the police said it'd be treated as a murder. It was almost like the school knew the part it played in his death, so we all played along to the facade that he was just another promising kid lost to the difficulties of adolescence. But he clearly knew what was going to happen to him. I saw that much in his eyes. That's why he laid there on the floor. That's why he wanted to drown. That thing in the pool had tagged him, and he lay down right there and then, ready to be eaten rather than go another second. Something about the sight of it just overrode every instinct inside him, and he lay down, ready, no, desperate, to die. Is that why I lie down too? Why I wake up on the floor of my classroom? Why I shudder into lucidity at 3 a.m, or sleepwalking from room to room? Am I waiting to die? To be eaten by the building itself? I teach lessons in the silence, sometimes deliberately, sometimes in my sleep. I teach about history, but no one else's, just my own. I write out episodes of my life on the blackboard like a study of the Tudors or Stuarts, assigning homework and asking questions, and even chastising the silent ghostly whispers in the back of the nocturnal classroom. To what extent was my alcoholism a consequence of modeling my mother's behavior? Compare and contrast the loss of my father with the loss of my wife. Were the negative effects accumulative, or did they interact in unforeseen ways? How has age altered my politics? Compare and contrast my voting habits as a young adult with those of the last election cycle. One day I came into the darkness, half remembering a lesson on the role music played in my adolescent identity, and instead of continuing, I asked an instinctual question that surprised even myself. "Why do I do this?" I said, my voice unnaturally loud and clear in the silence. One by one, the shadowy chairs scraped back as the unseen students rose, and ghostly footsteps filled the room as they filed out. "Lesson over," I muttered, as I was filled with a deep, despairing loneliness that made me realize just how brittle the truth is. Lately, I've started getting things mixed up. I teach the wrong lessons to the wrong students, and a few reports have gone in about my behavior. It's not always guaranteed that I'll wake up to find darkness all around me. Instead, there have been times I've awoken to a crowd of kids giggling at finding me asleep on the floor, with the sun out bright and strong. It'd be one thing if Mrs. Wares dragged me in to give me a bollocking when this happens, but she just asks me if I'm doing okay, if I'm fine, if my home life is trying. She looks at me with pity, and it breaks my heart. I wish she'd be angry instead, because the more she coos, the more she calls to me to check in on the place at night, and the more I feel like the center of a cruel joke. Sometimes I visit the playground from when this place taught under 12s. It must have been a long time ago, because now it's a giant pile of collapsed metal pipework, and thanks to a hole in the nearby fence that has made it a popular place to fly tip all kinds of rubbish. It's isolated from the rest of the grounds by a short hedge and a weak fence, but the kids know about it anyway, and sometimes go there to smoke, although not often. I like to look at it from my house. It's so ugly and brutalist. It looks like the kind of sculpture you'd find at the Tate, with a placard mentioning things like late-stage capitalism or the inevitability of death. Whatever it is, I watch it and listen to it, and occasionally visit it in person. I swear the pile changes, sometimes even just between blinks of the eye. I've pulled out bloody axes and bike chains, pointed knives with clumps of hair and matted gore along the edge, tricycles smashed to pieces with bits of headlight in the spokes. All these things make me feel queasy in the stomach. Supposedly, the pile eats pets, which is a rumor that works wonders for keeping kids away in the day, but has only piqued my curiosity. I've pulled out my fair share of crumpled pets and torn collars, but for some reason I'm not sure they come from the things around here. I have nightmares about climbing down between the endless beams of rusted, jagged metal and climbing on forever and ever with no stop. It's an unspoken certainty, a belief held deep within my chest, but I don't think that pile rests on asphalt at all. I think it doesn't stop. I think it gathers things of loss and regret and guilt, just like everywhere else in this school. Are there blackboards in the day? I stopped not so long ago and held a dry erase marker in my hand, stumped by the most unbelievable thought. When I teach at night, I use chalk. I've even gone home and washed my clothes to clear them of all the dust. But then how do I come in and teach the class using a whiteboard? My memories are becoming fuzzier with time, perhaps because of the drink, perhaps not. Sometimes I think back to my experience in the computer lab, and my finger is pushing the heavy button of a clunky CRT monitor. Sometimes I simply depress the dainty touchscreen button of a modern LCD. Which one was it exactly? Could it be both? Might it have happened more than once? I'm not sure it's the same school come night. And in fact, it feels worse as time wears on. There's an acceleration happening behind the scenes, just out of sight. Sometimes I visit the hall and half of the tiles have fallen down, and the faceless boy looks sad as he perches along the vents and wiring. Sometimes the pool has grown thick with algae, and the tiles have decayed and the window panes along the roof have been smashed to pieces. And the only hint of the aquatic inhabitant is the disturbance of the grotesque pond scum as it tracks my movement from edge to edge, grotty trainers and children's shoes and human hair rising to the surface as the water churns. But was it always like that? Why do I have memories of pulling James out of a sewage-riddled pool, pushing through thick green water as I dove in to drag him up? When did I even see the photo of him stuffed into a storm drain? And yet, I remember it so clearly. He was a good kid, I think. Sometimes he's there, amid the faces that surround me when I wake up in the middle of the day to bright lights and laughter. Sometimes he asks questions as I talk about my experiences growing up, his hand raised as he asks if my 3 weeks with mono will appear on the final exam. That doesn't make sense, but I don't question it. It's my duty to educate after all, and I think he needs it where he is. I hate this place, but I can't leave it alone. I feel hollowed out most days. I'm forgetting things a little too important, things I don't want to let go of without a fight. But every time I speak to Mrs. Wares, I lose all sense of time and just find myself agreeing to everything she says. Have I met her? In person? I'm sure I have. She's spoken to me in her office, but is that the same as seeing her in person? I can't say. I must have interviewed for this position, right? I must have. I remember asking her about lunch, about the canteen, and she gave me the funniest answer. "Oh, don't worry about that," she smiled. "No one here needs a canteen, but they might just gobble you right up." Did I laugh at the time or leave? I think I stormed out of her office after she said something I didn't like. Something about my wife, maybe. Except, well, after storming out, I went straight back to work in my classroom, which was always just a few doors from her office, which now that I think about it just doesn't seem right. But then again, my name has always been on the faculty list. I've read it there multiple times, but like I said, my memory grows fuzzier with time. Things change. This school has changed, I think, but I can never revisit the past, can I? Only what I remember of it. I remember it one way, but sometimes I stand in the silence, in the pitch black nothingness of a moonless night, and I wonder if it has always been exactly as it is now. Change is so hard to keep track of. Why is it that when I awake on the floor, my clothes have gotten bigger? I must be so very old. Was I as old as I am a few years ago? Of course not. What a stupid question. It's just that sometimes I walk around here and I feel like an octogenarian, which doesn't quite sit right in my mind. Shouldn't I be, mid-40s? Or is that a meaningless question to a drunk? Still, I keep going. I keep teaching, although lately it feels like I teach more at night than at day. Sometimes I never even see the sunrise. It just keeps going. One long episode without end. I hope to take a break soon, to retire. God knows I need it. I just need to clear my head, to get it all down in one place. To think clearly, if only for a few minutes. But after writing it all down, I feel only more confused than I did before. My most recent question for the students, written in chalk on a blackboard, illuminated only by moonlight, leaves me feeling empty and alone. I don't like it. What is eating my mind? I work at Faywood National High School, and they have a set of rules to follow. This story is told from the perspective of a woman. My name is Laura May Santos, and I am a teacher in Faywood National High School. I moved here a few months ago after I immigrated to the US from the Philippines. My psychologist prescribed to me that I should write down my experiences in this journal he gave me before moving here to this relatively unknown town in Pennsylvania. I did some research on this place, but I've yet to find some info about it. The local library has barred me from entry due to them not allowing outsiders to read through their materials. The only thing I know about this place is that it is weird and the people in it are weirder. The weirdest thing here is probably the school I work at. It's called Faywood National High School, and it's located in a wooded and secluded part of town that rarely gets any traffic aside from the strange buses that come in and out of campus grounds. The woods surrounding the place have a creepy feeling to them, like I'm being watched by something just lurking out of view. The school itself is a Victorian building with some wings and areas looking much older than that. The west wing, for example, is clearly the original building due to its aged look and feel. In fact, the very air around that place feels ancient in a creepy way. Anyways, back to the main topic. I was hired by the school after I got a recommendation from a fellow faculty member and downstairs neighbor of mine, Mr. Reynolds. The story of how I met him is for another day, but thanks to him, I was able to secure an interview with the school administration regarding my qualifications. They told me to visit the administration building near the school on a Monday. When the day came, Mr. Reynolds accompanied me to the building after he gave me a ride on his old Ford pickup truck. I gave them the papers and information they asked for, as well as my CV and resume, but they just looked relieved that someone actually wanted the position. Which is really strange now that I think about it, but back then I just chalked it up to there not being enough people in the town. Anyways, they asked me some information regarding my education and professional background, as well as the reason I immigrated to the States. Then they asked me some strange questions like whether I could kill in a moment's notice, do I believe in the supernatural, or if I can work under pressure and stuff like that. Since I was pretty eager to get a job back then, I went along with it. Big mistake. After the interview, they gave me a booklet and told me to read it before I start working the next week. It was a neat booklet with a nice design to it, a picture of the school on the front and a map of the school at the back. I'll be skipping over the first part of the booklet because it's just basic rules and guidelines that you'd find on a normal school handbook. It just covers what time school grounds close, basic etiquette regarding fellow staff and students, and other such things. The part I find really strange is the second part of the booklet. It's a set of rules and guidelines for us staff to follow and what we should do in some scenarios. Anyways, I'll be leaving the list here so I won't lose it. It might be important. Welcome to Faywood National High School. The general guidelines and code of conduct have already been discussed in the first part. The second part of this booklet will discuss the rules and guidelines within the campus grounds for our staff. It is of the utmost importance that any and all staff are to read and memorize this set of rules if they wish to last even a day within our esteemed establishment. The rules in this booklet are not set in stone. Changes, additions, and redactions can occur if the administration deems it necessary. Rule number 1. Attendance is important. Ensure that a proper roll call and attendance checking is carried out before classes start and at the end of the day, as well as after activities outside of the classroom. If one or more children are missing, or if there are one or more additional children, please call the administration building with the phone provided to you and calmly but quickly escort the children to the chapel beside the administration building. Rule number 2. Classes start at 7:30 a.m. If a student shows up 30 minutes late, do not let them enter the classroom. They are not who they claim to be. Rule number 3. If a student is exhibiting signs of possession or strange behavior, contact the administration building immediately. A staff member will arrive within 2 minutes. Pray the Lord's Prayer with the children while waiting for the staff member. Rule number 4. All staff members are expected to wear any form of iron, silver, or gold on their person at all times. An iron ring will be given to any and all staff members unable to comply with this rule in the administration building. Rule number 5. There are 7 dogs that patrol the campus grounds. All of them are friendly and trained by the resident groundskeeper. All of them are white in color. Contact the groundskeeper if a dog with black fur and red eyes is spotted within the campus grounds. Do not approach it. It is not a dog. Rule number 7. Entry into the woods near the West Wing are strictly prohibited during the hours of 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., as well as the hours of 4 p.m. to 3 p.m. The inhabitants there are active during those hours, and they do not take kindly to adults disturbing them. Rule number 8. If you find yourself within those woods during those hours, stay put and stay quiet. It may increase your chance of survival. You may be approached by strange creatures, but if you followed the 4th rule, they cannot harm you. There are exceptions, however, but it is best to not follow the sun, nor to move from your spot, even if someone beckons to you. Rule number 8. It is best to leave offerings of milk and food within the classroom after classes. Rule number 9. If a teacher wearing the attire of a 19th century plague doctor enters the room, you are expected to greet him like other staff members. He is in charge of history classes. Do not ask about what is under the mask. Rule number 10. The headmaster owns 2 ravens. If you encounter one, you are obligated to offer a lock of your hair or a small piece of your flesh to it. If you encounter both, you are expected to offer a finger to both of them. Rule number 11. There are only 3 wings on the campus: the West Wing, the East Wing, and the South Wing. If you find yourself with an unfamiliar wing, locate room 333 immediately. Do not enter the rooms. Do not look inside the other rooms. Do not look at the people passing you by, and do not talk to anyone talking to you. Rule number 12. If a girl wearing a white dress appears during your classes, treat her as if she was a normal student. Do not question the bloodstains on her dress, and do not question her regarding her missing eye. Rule number 13. The cafeteria offers a wide selection of food. If the lunch lady offers you today's special, you are to reject the offer and ask for the usual instead. If she instead offers you a drink, you are expected to accept it and drink it in front of her. Do not throw up or spit it out. Rule number 14. Staff are expected to greet and bow their heads to the hall monitor if he were to pass by. Not doing so may lead to the janitors working overtime. Rule number 15. The library is off limits to staff during 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. If you were to be locked in during those hours, you are encouraged to write your will within the logbook. Rule number 16. Staff are required to use the allotted restrooms and break rooms. Use the maintenance rooms for rituals and sacrifices. Rule number 17. Do not approach the hooded ones in the West Wing. Staff are to call administration if they are spotted in other areas of the campus aside from the West Wing. Rule number 18. Fairy circles are common occurrences within campus grounds. Do not be alarmed by their presence. If a fairy circle contains signs of foulness or dead animals within its confines, contact the groundskeeper immediately. Rule number 19. There is a series of stone structures south of the indoor swimming pool. Staff are not to approach the place unless ordered to by the administration. Rule number 20. A man with deer horns patrols the woods during the winter months. Staff and students are not to interact with the creature. If the creature approaches, run towards the building. Rule number 21. Do not trust the shadow people in room 41 in the East Wing. They are trapped there for a reason. Rule number 22. Do not be alarmed if one of the bus drivers takes off his head. Rule number 23. If a group of naked women is spotted near the pool, staff are to contact administration. Rule number 24. Any staff that encounters Mr. Pan are to escort him to the maintenance shed and provide him the wine and psychedelics stored in the lockers located inside of the room. They are to lock the doors immediately once he drinks the wine and to call the administration immediately. I signed up for a psychology experiment at school. I'm pretty sure I've made a huge mistake. I'm in junior college, and for a number of reasons, probably having something to do with my feelings of guilt, I won't say where I go to school. I'm a financial aid kind of student though, so I have to spend a portion of my energy every month figuring out how to get enough money to feed myself. I'd known a couple of girls who work in the cafeteria last year, and they'd sneak me food regularly, but they both graduated last summer. Oh well, easy come, easy go. I lived most of last summer in a broken down van that belonged to one of my friends. Well, I slept in the van. I'd hang out at the student union a lot during the day when I wasn't in class, and I'd use the faculty shower in the basement of the biology building at least every other day. Not the most comfortable way to live, but I managed. At the end of last semester though, just before Christmas break, I was perusing a bulletin board in the psych building, bulletin boards being a useful resource for people like me, and I came across a notice that caught my eye. The notice had said, "Be a subject in experimental therapy," and then it listed a phone number. Nothing terribly interesting about that, but there was an additional line at the bottom that read, $100 per week. I didn't need to know anything else about it. I was in. I called the number on the notice and spoke to a guy with a deep voice who called himself Trey. He was working on his doctorate in psychology and was pursuing this therapy experiment as part of his dissertation. I agreed to meet with him, so I showed up at his office at the appointed time. Trey was tall and lean, had morose-looking eyes and a full beard. There was also a girl with him. Her name was Kimberly. She was short and large-chested. She was working on her doctorate as well, and would be running the experiment along with Trey. They told me that because of the nature of the experiment, I would need to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and they would likewise keep my participation secret. Also, I wouldn't be told who else was participating in the experiment with me. They asked if I had any questions, and I did, just one. How was I to be paid? Kimberly told me I'd be given $100 cash at the end of each weekly session, and they anticipated that the experiment would last through the entirety of the spring semester. I could already feel the exhilaration. My money problems were over, at least for the next 4 months. In retrospect, I probably should have asked about the experiment itself, as in what would be expected of me, but the thought of having all that money pretty much trumped everything else. I signed their papers, then we all shook hands, and I agreed to come back to Trey's office on the first day of the spring semester. Christmas break came and went, and I showed up at Trey's office early in the morning on the first day back on campus. He showed up about 30 minutes later, and, after a brief discussion, he led me to a small room that had a table and 2 chairs and a flat-screen TV on the wall. He gave me a sheet of paper and a pencil, asked me to work the problems on the paper, then he left the room. The paper had about 100 simple math problems on it. Things like 35 plus 21 and 19 minus 8. I found it rather amusing, but I spent the next few minutes working the problems, and then I sat and waited for what seemed an unusually long period of time. Just before I got up to see if they'd forgotten me though, Kimberly came in the room carrying a clipboard, a pen, and a black leather pouch, and sat in the chair across the table from me. She was dressed in a nice pair of jeans and a button-down polo shirt, which she promptly began unbuttoning. I was taken aback by her nonchalance as much as anything, and I started to say something, but I didn't. She continued unbuttoning until she'd removed her shirt, leaving nothing on top but a sheer, violet-colored bra. She picked up her clipboard and started asking me questions. Things like, where was I from and how many siblings did I have? I think I answered all her questions. I mean, I was distracted, but I did the best I could, and she took down all my answers on her clipboard. Once the question and answer period came to an end, she reached into her little leather pouch and brought out a syringe, fully meaning to inject me with whatever it was inside. I protested. Well, I asked her what was in the syringe. She told me it was a mild form of Demerol, nothing to worry about. It was just to help me relax for the next phase of the experiment. The obvious concern her explanation raised was, in short, what was about to happen that would require me to be sedated. Before I asked, though, she explained that I would sit alone and watch 2 short videos, and then she and Trey would come back in and ask me some questions. The drug was to help prevent me from letting my inhibitions influence my responses. I thought about it for a second, becoming aware of the hunger in my stomach and anticipating the $100 I'd be getting at the end, and finally figured, what the heck? If she could sit there in that sheer bra and ask me questions, I could take a little muscle relaxant and watch a few videos. She gave me the shot, in the shoulder, and then she left the room. The lights dimmed, and I began to feel the effects of the drug. Nothing too severe, but I could definitely feel myself getting lighter. Then, the TV came on, and the video that played was of a large bulldozer-type contraption, making lots of noise and pushing piles of garbage into a massive pit, like at a city dump. After about a minute, the screen went blank, and then the next video started to play. It was of a field out in the country, and it was filled with wildflowers and clover. There was a pond in the distance, and I could hear birds singing. It was very peaceful, and I could feel the tension brought on by the bulldozer begin to melt away. Like the first video, it came to an end after about a minute. The TV turned off, the lights came on, and Trey and Kimberly came back into the room. She'd put her shirt back on and was carrying her clipboard against her chest. He was smoking a pipe and repeatedly tapping the tips of his fingers together. It was all pretty much no nonsense from there. Trey sat in the chair across from me and started asking me questions about my feelings, how I'd reacted to each of the videos. Kimberly stood over his shoulder and recorded my answers on her clipboard. After about 5 minutes, they put me through a brief series of physical tests designed to detect intoxication, like standing on one foot and touching the end of my nose. Once they were satisfied that I was okay, Kimberly gave me 5 $20 bills, and we agreed to meet the same time next week. Never mind about that being one of the strangest experiences I'd had since I'd been in college, and that I couldn't seem to get the image of Kimberly's breasts out of my mind, but the $100 had unquestionably been the easiest money I'd ever made. I was giddy, almost euphoric. I went straight to the Mexican dive on the edge of campus and ordered a grande burrito. Except for when I'd spend some of their money, I hardly thought about Trey and Kimberly for the rest of the week, with one notable exception. I took a drive out to the country Friday afternoon with a good friend of mine, just to clear our heads and decompress, and while driving down a back road and drinking a beer, we passed by a field very similar to the one I'd seen in the video. I thought it was a happy coincidence, and I didn't think of it again. The next Monday morning, bright and early, I was back at Trey's office. We went through the same routine, simple math problems from Trey and topless questions from Kimberly. At some point I must have snickered or something because she asked me what was so funny. I told her that nothing was funny, but I found it strange that she had taken off her shirt. She asked if it made me uncomfortable, and I said of course not. She wrote down my response and moved on. Then there was the injection, and I was left alone to watch the videos. The first video was similar to one of the videos from the time before, the one of the field and the flowers. It was nice, but otherwise unremarkable. The second video, though, was a bit more troubling. It appeared to have been shot by a security camera at an urban intersection, one with little shops and businesses lining the streets, people standing at crosswalks and waiting for the light to change. Once it did, a college-age guy with a backpack stepped ahead of the crowd and into the intersection and was immediately run over by a car. Once the car had cleared the frame, I could see the guy lying in an expanding pool of blood with a massive wound visible from the side of his head. It had happened so suddenly, I recoiled from the screen. Then the lights came on and Trey and Kimberly entered the room. I was rattled. I was pretty sure that that video had been real. Trey started asking me the same type of questions he'd asked me the week before, the ones about how I felt. Given that I was a college student trying to at least live up to their expectations, if not impress, I answered his questions as clinically and earnestly as I could. Once he'd finished asking his questions, Kimberly paid me and I left. Unlike the week before, I thought about Trey and Kimberly a lot over the following days, and the video as well. By then I'd also started trying to figure out what it was they were up to, what they were trying to accomplish with their seemingly random and disjointed experiment. Of course, I couldn't come up with anything coherent. Maybe it wasn't for me to question. They were psychology grads working on their doctorates after all, and I decidedly wasn't. That Friday, I agreed to meet one of my friends at a coffee shop just off campus. As I waited at the intersection for the light to change, I thought of the video again, and almost flinched as I saw the car strike the guy in my mind's eye. Then the light changed, and a guy wearing a backpack stepped into the intersection right in front of me. I didn't have time to warn him, nobody did. The car smashed into him, ran him over and left him lying in an expanding pool of blood right there in the street. Chaos ensued. People were screaming and seemed to be running in every direction. Several of us, though, we went to the guy on the street. I knew right away, as did the others, there was no life in him. His skull was gaped open and you could see his damaged brain through the fissure. It was nauseating. We waited until the cops showed up and then an ambulance. The EMTs took their time loading him into a bag and then into the back of the ambulance. I didn't wait for them to drive away. I'd seen enough. Over the weekend, I couldn't get the vision of what I'd seen out of my mind. I got drunk on Saturday night, but that didn't help. I woke up Sunday morning, hungover and still not able to keep from seeing that car run that poor guy over, just like I couldn't stop Trey and Kimberly's video playing in my head. How much of a coincidence was possible? Me watching their video and then seeing what I'd seen happen right in front of my eyes. And for that matter, the same was true for the first set of videos. Never mind that that video of the field and flowers had been benign, I'd still seen that field in real life. I was more than shaken up about the whole thing. I was disturbed. Were Trey and Kimberly running some sort of ESP experiment? What was that drug they were giving me, really? Could it be that I was somehow involved in that guy getting run over? That my being there had influenced it somehow? Why had two of the videos I'd seen come to fruition in real life, but not the other two? Did that say something about me? About the way my mind worked? Was I psychic at some level? Or had something about what I'd perceived in the videos played a part in what had happened later? It was bending my mind, trying to put it all together, and I wasn't getting better, I was getting worse. I'd been dating a girl named Kathy since just before Thanksgiving, and I'd been staying at her place pretty much every night this semester. By the time Sunday evening rolled around, I'd decided that I couldn't keep this to myself any longer, and to hell with their non-disclosure agreement. I had to talk to somebody about it, and Kathy was at hand. I told her everything. The math problems, Kimberly taking off her shirt, the drugs, the videos, and I tied it all together with what I'd seen happen. In all honesty, I think she'd been more concerned about Kimberly taking off her shirt than anything, although she did at least acknowledge the coincidence. She didn't seem to be nearly as freaked out by it as I was, though. She asked me if I was going to go back to Trey's office in the morning, whether I was going to keep participating in their experiment, and I honestly couldn't give her an answer. Monday morning, though, my nearly empty wallet reminded me of why I had agreed to be a part of their experiment in the first place. Reluctantly, I found myself at Trey's office door, waiting for him to show up. Things were going to be different this time, though. I wanted to know what was going on. I wanted to know more about the drug they were giving me, and how it was possible that I'd seen in real life what I'd seen in two of the videos they'd shown me, but not the other two. I wanted answers. If they were going to use me in their little experiment, They were going to tell me more about what was going on. Trey finally arrived and led me to the little room. I started telling him about what I'd seen on Friday, but he shushed me, told me that my narrative wasn't part of the experiment at this stage, and that I should voice any concerns I had to Kimberly. Then, as always, he handed me the paper and pencil and left the room. I sat there brooding for a while, telling myself I should leave and put all this crap behind me, but in the end I worked the math problems and waited for Kimberly to come. She did, and as usual, she took off her shirt after she'd sat. I started talking before she started asking me questions though. I told her about seeing the field in real life, and then that I'd seen the guy get run over in the street. I told her I was having doubts about whether or not I should continue participating in their experiment, and that I would have to know more about what was going on if I was going to stay. Her response? She asked me in a condescending tone if I truly thought that me watching a video in this room had actually gotten someone killed 4 days later. Putting it like that, by someone in her position, did make the supposition seem rather silly, but still, I wasn't ready to let it go. I started to make my next point, whatever it was, but she reached behind her back, unclasped her bra, and let it fall from her shoulders. Never underestimate a 20-year-old's infatuation with the female physique. I literally forgot what I was going to say, and she took the opportunity to start asking me her set of questions. This time, however, the questions were of a more personal nature. Things like, was I gay or straight, and was I more aroused by visuals or by touch? I don't know if her removing her bra had been premeditated or if it had been a diversionary tactic, but the next thing I knew, she had given me the injection and left the room. The lights dimmed and the first video started. I recognized the place. It was the student union where I had spent so much of my time over the last few years. There were dozens and dozens of my classmates coming in and out of the frame, some stopping and chatting with others in small groups, others moving with purpose as if they had somewhere to be. Then, suddenly, there came a huge explosion from inside the union building, blowing out the doors and filling the screen with dust and wreckage. I was shocked, caught completely off guard, and despite the drug's alleged calming effects on my state of mind, I could feel my anxiety level rise sharply. Once the sounds of the explosion began to recede and the dust began to settle, I saw the carnage the explosion had wrought. There were people lying everywhere, on the steps, on the sidewalk, in the grass, all of them covered in debris and blood. Some of them were screaming in agony, and others were lying perfectly still. One poor girl had lost an arm and was staggering around in a circle. Another was sitting by the union steps, cradling someone's head in her lap, a disembodied head. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was mortified. Then, as usual, without any fanfare, the video came to an end. I was fighting with the dissonance in my mind over what I'd just seen. I knew the video had to have been some sort of CGI creation. I mean, I'd passed by the student union on the way over this morning. There hadn't been any explosion. I wanted to get up and leave, but as though I had been conditioned not to, almost like something was holding me to the chair, I stayed in my seat. Only a few seconds later, the second video began. To my bewilderment, it showed me on the screen, sitting in this room, in this chair, behind this table. I had a despondent look on my face and was moving my eyes from one spot on the floor to another. Then, in an exceedingly casual way, I brought up a pistol from my lap, placed the muzzle against my temple, and blew my brains out. I was horrified. I sprang up from my chair so hard it slapped back against the floor. I couldn't seem to take my eyes from the image on the screen though, me, lying in a lifeless heap beside the table, a pool of blood spreading across the floor from beneath my head. I couldn't seem to catch my breath. Finally, the video ended, and I bent at the waist and put my hands on my knees. I didn't even notice the lights come back on, but they did apparently, and in strolled Trey and Kimberly, him smoking his pipe, and her carrying a clipboard against her chest. There was a brief moment after Trey had sat in his chair when we all stared at one another, them looking at me as though they were waiting for me to take my seat so we could be on with it, and me looking at them as though they were sadistically insane. Finally, I think I might have said something like, "Y'all are freaking crazy," and then I left the room. I walked straight out of the building, then past the student union, the still intact student union, and I didn't stop until I'd made it all the way back to Kathy's. Her roommate was leaving just as I made it up the porch steps. She told me that Kathy was in class, but that I could wait inside if I wanted. I did. I went straight to the refrigerator, grabbed and drained a beer, then grabbed another and took a seat at their little dinette table. It took me a minute or so to gather my thoughts, but soon enough, I got wound up. Obviously, the videos I'd just watched were computer generated, but my god, they had looked so real. I couldn't even begin to fathom what Trey and Kimberly had been intending, but that didn't really seem the point. 2 weeks ago, I'd seen 2 videos, one of a bulldozer and one of a country field. The following Friday, I'd actually seen that very field when I'd been riding the back roads with my friend. A week later, I'd seen 2 more videos, one of another serene little pasture, and one of a guy getting plowed over by a car. The following Friday, I'd seen a guy get plowed over by a car. Today, I'd seen 2 videos, one of a horrific explosion inside the student union building that had decimated a large group of my fellow students, and one of me blowing my brains out. It made me feel crazy to even think about it, but how could I not worry that one of those 2 videos would prove true this coming Friday? I stayed at Kathy's the rest of the day drinking beer, and by the time Kathy got home, I'd decided not to share anything about what I'd seen in the psych lab. I must have passed out sometime that evening, because the next thing I remembered was waking up on the couch late Tuesday morning. I showered and got dressed, and then I went and got myself something to eat with the last few dollars I had, which reminded me that I hadn't gotten my $100 from Kimberly. I started to go to the psychology building to collect, but I really didn't feel up to it. Instead, I went to a friend's apartment, one who was always looking for a reason to drink, and spent the rest of the day there. We stayed up drinking most of the night, in fact, and then after sleeping for a little while, we resumed our binge the next morning. The rest of that day was pretty much a blur to me. I remember a bunch of people coming over that afternoon and Kathy calling me that night, but that's about it. The next morning, Thursday morning, I got up and made my way to campus, not to go to class, but to brood. After 3 days of drinking, I was feeling less than optimal, and in the sober light of day, I found that I still couldn't get those video images out of my mind. It didn't make any sense, but more and more I was feeling responsible for the death of that guy who'd been run over by the car. And as I sat there watching my fellow students come and go, I began to feel more and more certain that a calamity was about to befall a good many of them, and it would be my fault. I couldn't shake it. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the image out of my mind. At some point that afternoon, I saw one of the girls from the video, the one who'd had her arm blown off and had been walking in a circle. She passed by the couch where I was sitting, and it was all I could do to keep from grabbing her and yelling for her to run, to get away from the student union and to stay away, especially tomorrow. That's when I realized I'd probably been sitting there with my thoughts long enough, so I got up and left. I wandered around campus aimlessly for an hour or so, watching all the people I'd pass, wondering who among them would be in the vicinity of the student union tomorrow. About the time the sun started setting, I found myself standing in front of the psychology building, and all of a sudden I got mad. Who the hell did they think they were, Trey and Kimberly, those arrogant doctoral students? What gave them the right to play with people's lives like they'd been playing with mine? Screw their stupid experiment. I wondered if their professors knew what they'd been up to, dispensing drugs to undergrads and showing them vile videos. I wondered how many of my classmates they'd ensnared into their little trap, and how many of them Kimberly had shown her tits to. She probably got off on it too, getting naked in front of young men under the guise of psychological research. Research my ass. They were just depraved, and they owed me $100. That's when I decided what I should do. Tomorrow morning, I'd go to Trey's office and wait around until I found one of them, and first, I'd demand my payment for the services rendered. No reason at all I shouldn't get paid for what they'd put me through. Then I'd find the dean of the psychology department, and I'd tell them what his prize students had been up to. They deserved it. They'd be outed for the sadistic frauds they were. Yeah, that's what I'd do. First thing in the morning.